Hi, everybody. My name is Tom White, and my day job is I'm the University Archivist and Curator of Special Collections at Duquesne University. I'm also an adjunct professor at Duquesne and an adjunct professor of history and folklore at La Roche College. And tonight I want to tell you a little bit about my newest book, The Witch of the Monongahela, Folk Magic in Early Western Pennsylvania. And this is my 11th book. Let me get this part out of the way early on. They're all available on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and through all the usual retailers. If you're interested, let me hold the book up so you can see it. But this isn't my first book on witchcraft. I wrote a book in 2013 called Witches of Pennsylvania, Occult History and Lore. And a lot of people don't realize that Pennsylvania has many, many tales of witchcraft, way more than New England or any place up there in Massachusetts or anything. In fact, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, there's far more accounts and cases of witchcraft. The difference is the witches weren't killed here. They weren't executed, so people didn't pay as much attention. And for about 20 years, I've been researching the folklore, legends, and mainly supernatural folklore, but legends, urban legends, stories of witchcraft, monsters, etc., from kind of an academic perspective, but also not entirely skeptical all the time.
Hello.
Approach to these stories in Pennsylvania. And so The Witch of the Monongahela is a book I've been thinking about writing for a long time. There's a story of a witch. The Witch of the Monongahela is her real name's Mary Derry. Everyone called her Moll Derry or Old Moll. And I'd circled around this story several times. I've written about her before, but just really kind of touching on the legends that exist already. And as I kind of circled around, I kept thinking there's got to be more to this. And so eventually I decided to write this book, just drilling down into the story of Moll Derry and setting it in context and seeing what we could find out about her and what we couldn't. And so Moll Derry is this woman who lived in Fayette County in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. She died in the early 1840s. So she lived a long time. And she's been associated with stories of witchcraft and fortune-telling and divination and folk magic in all the years since. And there's been many people that have written about her or using a pseudonym for her. And she's worked her way into many stories and many tales, both fictional and nonfiction, in the regional tales, especially from that area in Fayette County, but also throughout southwestern PA. And Moll Derry was definitely a real person, right? But people said she could see the future. People would approach her if they needed their fortunes told, or if they lost something, say they lost money or an animal out in the wilderness, or anything, a loved one even. They were trying to find them. Someone disappeared into the forest. And so Moll Derry would help with these things, but she also could supposedly help with a little bit of healing. And I'll explain how that works with folk magic in a minute. But Moll Derry was also, known to have a temper, and you didn't want to get on her bad side. And people said she could actually even fly in the air by rocking in a cradle. She'd launch herself in the air. Some people said she'd even fly on a broomstick, like a traditional witch. One of my favorite things about her is she could supposedly control all the rattlesnakes in the mountains near her home. It's just south of Haydenton in Fayette County, which is south of Uniontown. And supposedly the hill she lived on was guarded by rattlesnakes that obeyed her command. But Moll Derry, was also, even though most of the time she helped people and people came to her for assistance, she supposedly, had this temper. And, if you crossed her, your bread may not rise, or animals might wander off or get sick. And there were a few people who really pushed her and ended up dead. And many of the legends revolve around these people. And so I think I'll start by telling you the legends as they're told today before I kind of went backwards in time to explain them. So there's four main legends that she's associated with. One is the story of the three hanged men, and supposedly around 1795, Moll Derry, and she would have been younger at this point, was in the marketplace down near Haydenton. And some people say she was in the mountains, but there was a crowd around to witness this. And so she was supposedly in the marketplace, and these three guys started making fun of her supposed ability to see the future. And when she, she tried to ignore them for a few minutes, and finally she turned to them and said, "You're all going to hang." And of course, there were witnesses to this, and everyone, they continued to mock her. But then a lot of people, took it very seriously. She gave them kind of the evil eye and walked away. Well, sure enough, about 6 months later, the first guy, his name was John McFall, became the first man ever hung in Fayette County. And McFall got into a bar fight, basically, at a tavern, which this was just some guy's cabin up in the mountains that he sold, alcohol at. And he was basically kicked out because he was too drunk. Went outside, they locked the door, and he got angry, pried the door off its hinges, ripped the door off, and went in the tavern and beat the owner to death. He was sentenced and hung very quickly. The second guy, who I'll get to in a minute, he helped murder a peddler, and then he fled to Ohio after he committed the murder. Shortly thereafter, he also got in a bar fight, killed a man in Ohio, and then was sentenced to hang, in which, previously he confessed to his name was Ned Cassidy. He confessed to the murder in Fayette County. Right after that, the third guy, who they don't really know his name, some sources give him a name, but the third guy heard about the first two, went to Greene County, and hung himself. And so everyone that was there or talked about the legend thought that it had come true, and Moll Derry had cursed these men. Well, there's a side story for that Ned Cassidy, the second guy, and that involves the murdered peddler. See, this murdered peddler, being a peddler was a dangerous job back then. You're traveling from town to town, selling goods, in colonial America or early America, and you're carrying all that money with you, so you could potentially be robbed or murdered for your money. Well, these two guys, this guy named John Updike and then Ned Cassidy, of course, met this peddler who was coming through Fayette County. And he actually knew John Updike from back in New Jersey. Well, Updike invited him to stay with him, and they sat and they drank for a while. But the peddler had wanted to see Moll Derry. He had heard about her and wanted his fortune told. So Updike and Cassidy said, "Oh, we'll take you to Moll Derry." But instead, they took him up to a mill pond. Some people say Rupel's Mill, but some people say another mill. They're all real close to each other up there. And they beat him to death, took his money, and threw his body in the mill pond. Well, the legend goes that right before he fled to Ohio, Ned Cassidy approached Moll Derry one day, asking for something to help him sleep, implying he felt guilty or he just was nervous about the murder. And as he walked up, Moll Derry said, "Why are you coming to me after your dirty work at the mill pond?" In which case he got scared and fled to Ohio. And we know what happens to him there. The other guy, John Updike, suffered a worse fate, perhaps. At that time, Moll Derry supposedly had an apprentice named Hannah Clark, who she was teaching folk magic to. And Hannah, one day received a visitor from one of the councilmen from Haydentown, and he came down to visit her. And he saw on the back of her door, and she lived just down the road from John Updike. And on the back of her door was this picture that looked like Updike's face, like if someone drew a picture of somebody in chalk. And there were two nails tapped into it. And he thought that it was weird, and he asked her what it was, and she said, "That's a picture of John Updike." And she said, "He's the one that killed killed the man they found in the pond. Every time I tap these nails, his head's going to hurt worse and worse. And eventually he's going to confess." And so the guy didn't believe it at first, but out of curiosity, on the way home, he stopped at Updike's cabin, and Updike was complaining about a headache. Well, He made a point every couple days to come back to see what was going on. At first, he'd visit and see where the nails were, and then he'd go up to visit Updike. And sure enough, Updike was getting worse and worse. This continued for a long time until the nails were almost the whole way in. And finally, he went up to see Updike, and Updike confessed to the murder. In which case, the man ran back down and told Hannah Clark, and she said, "That's great." She picked up the hammer and drove the nails in the rest of the way. The man ran back up and found Updike dead. And so that was the second story, the story of the murdered peddler. The third story that Moll Derry is associated with, sometimes under the name Moll Pry, and they used to say she had all these aliases because people who wrote about her during her lifetime were afraid to offend her. But supposedly Moll Derry warned young Polly Williams not to go to the White Rocks with Philip Rogers. Now, the story of the White Rocks is another classic Western Pennsylvania legend. What happened is young Polly Williams worked as a housekeeper in a house, in the wealthier house, and next door was a young man who was fairly well-to-do, and he had taken a liking to this housekeeper, the neighbor's housekeeper. And even though they had the class difference, he continued to promise to marry her and take care of her and all this stuff. But as time went on, it looked like they were going to get married, and so Polly's family moved out west further. And she stayed behind to get married to him. But a year passes, another year passes, and finally, Polly, by around 1810, is frustrated, and she's out walking with her friend one day, and they bump into Moll Derry. Moll Derry warns her, and the famous line from the fictional, one of the fictional accounts by Hill, a guy named A.F. Hill. The fictional account says that they asked her, "Does she tell fortunes?" And Moll Derry replied, "Yes, and misfortunes too." And she basically told the fortunes of the two young women. And supposedly she warned Polly Williams not to go to the White Rocks, which is like an outcropping made of white rocks, of course, in Fayette County, with Philip Rogers, or she'd die. And at first she's a little bit rattled. But a little time passes, and finally Philip Rogers comes up to her and says, I want to get married. I got the minister. Let's go. Get your dress. They took off, and he leads her up to the White Rocks. And at this point, she was just so happy to get married. She didn't question it or didn't resist. Well, nobody knows exactly what happened, but the next day they found her crumpled body at the base of the White Rocks. It looked like she had been hit in the head first and then thrown off. Philip Rogers was put on trial, but not found guilty because they had no direct evidence. He eventually moved further west into Greene County to get away from the town because everyone was suspicious of him. And so Polly didn't heed the warning and paid the price for not following the warning. Since Halloween, I also tell you this, supposedly you can see Polly Williams' ghost up at those White Rocks and near her gravesite, which isn't that far away. The fourth story that's commonly associated with Moll Derry takes place a little bit later, and this is, I'll explain this later, but it's in 1856, which obviously I told you she died in the 1840s, so it couldn't have actually been her. But under the name Moll Wampler, or sometimes Moll Dell, Moll Derry supposedly made a failed attempt to find the lost children of the Alleghenies. Now, again, the lost children of the Alleghenies is another famous story from Bedford County. It took place in 1856 when these two young children wandered away from their family's cabin and got lost in the woods. And they, in fact, I have a map here of the area. It was near Pavia in Bedford County. It was actually a marker. I'm just going to do this because I'll hold up the screen so you can see this old map. But that's the area in which the lost children would eventually be found. But they were the children of Samuel and Susanna Cox. And the children the mother thought they had followed the husband off to go hunting. He thought they were still at the cabin. It was April, but it was a cold April in 1856, and they wandered off. And for a long time, they searched for the children. A couple of days turned into weeks. The community even accused the parents of killing them. Some members of the search party decided to turn to get the help of a witch to find the children. They contacted supposedly Moll Derry, who used an Erdspiegel, which was basically, it means earth mirror. Basically, it was a dark mirror in a bag of earth. It functioned like a crystal ball, so the witch would look in the bag and be able to see where the children were. Well, Moll Derry was ultimately unsuccessful, although the children were found by supernatural means. On the other side of the mountain, a young man named Jacob Dibbert had a dream 3 nights in a row of walking through the woods and finding a log, then a shoe, and then the bodies of the children frozen. And he told his brother-in-law, Harrison Wysong, and Dibbert wasn't familiar with that side of the mountain, but Wysong was. And he agreed to take him over there, and sure enough, they found the log, the shoe, and the bodies. That story actually, folk musician Alison Krauss performed a song called Jacob's Dream, which is about that story. So anyway, those are the 4 core stories about Moll Derry. Now, Derry, though, as I already told you, obviously couldn't have been alive in that last story. So what I do in my book is I kind of look at the stories and how they evolved. And one of the things that I discovered is that Moll Derry is actually, although Moll Derry was a real person, Moll Dell, I mentioned that Moll Dell, she was a real person. Moll Wampler might have been a real person. And what happened in the mid-20th century, all their stories and earlier, their stories started to merge in popular tellings. So instead of there being 3 witches, there was 1 witch. And that's, I spend a lot of my book kind of dissecting how that happened. But before I get into any of that, first let me explain how folk magic worked in Western Pennsylvania and in general in Pennsylvania, and really still works around the world. So the idea of folk magic, we kind of think of witches, we get these kind of stereotypical Halloween witches in our mind, it's that time of year especially. But witchcraft, and this isn't, let me state this isn't modern neo-paganism like Wicca or anything like that. That's, even though they use the term witch, that isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about historical witchcraft as viewed kind of in Europe and then in early America at that time. The modern neo-pagan movement emerged after 1949. But anyway, often people confuse what I'm talking about. So anyway, this kind of the traditional ideas of witchcraft evolved over time. This was common from Europe and in the Americas. So the idea was that there's an evil witch, and a witch basically is someone who threatens the social order using folk magic, right, or magical means. In folk magic, I've been using that term. Folk magic just means magic that regular people do. It's not high ceremonial magic. It's not like necromancers or alchemists from the 1500s. If you're familiar with John Dee or somebody like that, it's not those kind of people. The learned, kind of up in the tower, magicians or people that thought of themselves as using magic. This was the kind of magic used by common people. And you might think, well, or common people using that much magic. Well, it's part of a system, basically. So at one end, you have the people that abuse it, and that's the witch, right? That's the far end. The witch is the evil use. But on the other end, you have the folk healers. And they are people that usually combine what we would consider folk magic or magical incantations with prayers, charms, herbs, amulets, paper amulets, regular amulets, and a variety of other things to try to heal people, find lost items, prevent hexes and prevent curses. And that's what the folk healer did, right, on that end. And that was often like the old grandmother or something. Although in Pennsylvania, practitioners of folk magic were basically evenly split between men and women, although women were still more likely to be publicly labeled witch. The thing is, there's an in-between category, and that's what they call, in Eastern PA, they eventually called it a hex doctor among the Pennsylvania Germans. In Western PA, they called them the witch master. And now, I should, this person is basically an in-between. They know the folk healing. They usually do the folk healing, but they know enough about witchcraft to stop it. They're more powerful at stopping it. And sometimes they can even kill the witch. And maybe for the right price even, they can do a little witchcraft themselves. Or at least, use some curses. So the idea is that, I should say this, that there's a strong German tradition of witchcraft in Pennsylvania and folk healing. It's they call it powwow out in eastern PA, the folk healers, in central PA, among the Pennsylvania Dutch. But it was common throughout the Germans, and the English had their own version too. Their folk healers were called the cunning folk, like, that they were kind of outwitting things. And most of the time, like I said, these used a combination of prayers, and they would use Bibles sometimes as like talismans. They would use magic, things like, I don't know if anybody's ever seen a Sator square. Let me find the picture of one here. But for an example of how folk magic would work would be a Sator square is like a Latin palindrome. They're not even sure exactly how common or the original source of it. Like this is, you see this, the bottom of the page here. That is a Sator square, right? You might inscribe that, say, for example, on a plate, right? And you keep that plate near your fireplace. If there's ever a fire, if you toss that plate into the fire will go out. Now, it might just go out because you threw a big heavy plate on it, but the idea was that it did that. And so folk magic worked through these principles of contagion and transference, right? So the idea was all bad stuff was caused by evil. And you could like catch it, even if you weren't, not intentionally. It could be transferred to you. It could be given to you by a witch or a hex, or you could accidentally kind of catch the evil. But at the same time, it could then be transferred away because it was contagious and could be transferred. You could send it away, right? So you could transfer it out of you. A classic example of this, and some of you may have family members or old grandmothers that would tell you this, that you could remove a wart with a potato, right? Like you rub a potato on a wart and make the wart go away. That's actually part of an old folk magic tradition. Like it was a charm, basically they call it. And basically what you do is you cut a potato in half, you rub it on the wart, and say 3 times, like maybe in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And you do it 3 times, and you take that potato, you'd either ritually bury it, so like basically you're putting it underground, you throw it in running water, which would trap the evil in the water, or you'd feed it to swine. And because in the Bible, Jesus transferred evil spirits into the pigs. And so like things like that would be an example of how folk magic was thought to work. And there'd be dozens and dozens of paper charms. There's charms for protecting against people larger than you, for trapping thieves, for curing various ailments, charms against firearms, charms on firearms to hunt. But a lot of charms to protect you from witches and curses, right? So the witches, just like practitioners could defend themselves using this folk magic, a witch could harm you using folk magic. So a common example of something a witch might do is they might shoot what they call a witch ball into your cattle. Now, that sounds ridiculous, but basically what that was is, and a lot of these deal with agriculture, because obviously agriculture was the primary economic source of income at that time. But a witch ball was basically a hairball in the stomach of like a cow, and cows can't vomit. So like they didn't understand why cows would get hairballs in their stomach and die. We do today, obviously, but back then they didn't. They'd find this like ball of hair in the stomach, so they thought like a witch hexed it. Then if you found that, you could actually hex other people with it, they believed. But that was evidence a witch was after you. Another thing a witch might do is steal the milk from your cow. And how they might do that is maybe take a hair from your cow or pick up dung from your cow out in the field. And they go home and they might say an incantation and wrap the hair or the dung in like a dish towel, hang it over a chair and put a bucket underneath and start milking it like it was a cow. And what people believed is the milk would flow into that bucket. Your cow would go dry miles away. And so it's all this idea of transference and contagion, much like how a voodoo doll works in the movies. That's actually exactly right how folk magic works. Although in Pennsylvania they weren't using voodoo dolls, but it's the same principle. Something represents something else. So there were also all these ways to fight back against a witch. Witches could be harmed by silver bullets, but you didn't have to shoot the witch. You could sometimes shoot a drawing of the witch. And I have some story about how it'd be witch, like up in Warren County, there was a famous witch hunter named John Mayer, no relation to the musician. But he would basically trace your outline. He'd light a candle and let the shadow of you fall on a piece of paper, and he'd trace the outline of the piece of paper. It'd have you move out of the way, and it'd shoot the piece of paper with a silver bullet in your outline. And wherever the witch was miles away, the witch would supposedly die. There were other ways most people didn't want to kill people, though, in this method, but there were other ways to flip a curse on a witch, like create a witch bottle. Say the witch was making you sick, right? They commonly thought witches would give people like wasting diseases, slow diseases that would make you be sick for a long time and kind of waste away, were often attributed to witchcraft. And so one of the things they would do is like maybe have you make a witch bottle, right? It sounds disgusting, but they might have you like urinate in a bottle, then put like 3 or 7 pins in the bottle to represent your pain, and then cork it and seal it with wax. Then what they do is put that inside another container and seal it entirely. And supposedly then the witch would be in misery until they came to you and asked you to open the bottle. And at that point, you kind of broke their hold over you and they couldn't hurt you. So these are just a few examples, but they had charms for making like basically magic wands. The whole idea of a magic wand comes from like water witching or dowsing, as we call it, where they make wands to find water and minerals. There were all kinds of methods of divination, healing, charms. People would carry paper charms folded up in their pocket. Actually, that's where paper footballs come from that let kids hit on their desk. In elementary, I don't know if kids still do that, but when I was in elementary school, people would fold up little triangles and flick them at each other and then put up their fingers like goalposts. Well, those things, that's how they used to fold up paper charms, and there'd be something written on there that was like for protection. Put it in your pocket. Sometimes they'd even feed it to cows to protect them from witchcraft. But anyway, I have dozens of other examples of these types of methods of folk magic and how they work. And people don't realize how widespread this was. There were literally dozens and dozens of cases in Western PA, let alone hundreds in the whole state. They actually talk about other cases in my book, The Seventh Tone. I'll just give you one example. In Somerset County, there was a man named John Summey who went to visit this woman who he kind of liked, but he had heard rumors about her that she might have dabbled in magic or occult forces. But she was her husband had died, and she was alone with several kids. He traveled all the way around this mountain to go visit her one day. And he got there around noon, stayed all day. She insisted he stayed for dinner. He stayed for dinner. She wanted him to stay all night, and he just said, no, I have to get back. And he said that she gave him this cold stare, was very angry, and then said, fine, go on your way. As he started walking back in the night, by this time it was dark, luckily there was a full moon. But as he was walking back, suddenly, this was the middle of winter, and there's snow all over the ground. Suddenly these geese start to circle around him, this big flock of geese, and it's dark outside, and they land nearby. Something about them unnerves him. So he picks up a stick and throws it at them. He said they all disappeared. They didn't fly off, they just vanished. So he picked up his pace and he went a little bit further, went this path through the woods. And as he was walking through the woods, he started to hear cats meowing and making noises. At first it was 1 or 2, and then it was dozens and dozens. And it sounded like there were hundreds of cats around him in the woods. And he just ran as fast as he could. And eventually he saw an old farmhouse up ahead, and he ran up that farmhouse and begged to stay the night there, and they let him in. In the morning he went back, and there had been no new snowfall. And he went back and retraced his steps, expecting to see all these tracks from different cats and everything. And there was nothing in the woods. He searched the woods thoroughly, and there were no tracks at all. He was convinced that she was controlling cats, or she appeared as a cat, because they thought witches could either have familiars, which were animals that served them, or could transform into these things. And she thought that she had basically harassed him in the form of these animals, or sent animals to torment him on his way home. Obviously, he never went back. So there's literally dozens of cases like that throughout Western PA. So it was very common, and the belief was very common. And the reason, the folk magic, I should say, was so widely practiced in Pennsylvania, I think one of the reasons is that, we did have one witch trial here back in the time of William Penn. This woman was put on trial who basically sounded like a problem neighbor, like you'd have today, like the person in the neighborhood that's always causing trouble. And the evidence against her was very sparse. Her name was Margaret Matson, and she was one of the old Swedish settlers that predated the English colony. And basically what happened is William Penn and these jurors were sitting there on this trial, and all this evidence supposedly came forward that she was a witch. It was all, very circumstantial, but it fit in the magical system. It was stuff that made sense to them. And so he finally, knowing what happened in Europe with all the witch trials and the death, he decided that he had them issue the verdict that she was guilty of being known as a witch, but not actually being a witch. That way he could find her and kind of put her under house arrest, but no one was convicted of witchcraft, which seems crazy, but he didn't want to set a precedent. And from that time on, no one was convicted of witchcraft. The thing is, everyone still believed in witchcraft. So if you were hexed, you couldn't count on the state or at that point the colony to do anything about it. So you had to turn to these practitioners to help you when you thought you were hexed. And it was pretty common. A lot of people dabbled in it. And a lot of people, and there were like the folk healers, like I said, that were quasi-professional. And the hex doctors or witch masters were more professional, you'd say. And then you had the witches who surprisingly, there were people that admitted to being the witches. And, to be the witch, you supposedly had to sell your soul to the devil. And there were several ways that could be done. There's several ceremonies, which I detailed in the book, but they're all a little bit disturbing. But this was people. There were people that admitted to that, and they were kind of ostracized. Now, sometimes I think people claim to admit to that because they were being harassed or something. It was to scare people off, but other people seem very serious in some of the old accounts. But anyway, the story, so this is the setting in which Moll Derry develops. There's this strong belief in witchcraft, just like today. All these things still exist today. Maybe not exactly in the same form, but 50% of Americans believe in ghosts and UFOs and Bigfoot and everything else. And part of this, I think, is the reason why this will never go away is because no matter how much science you have, science just tells you how things work. It doesn't impart any meaning in the world, right? And, like for example, with witchcraft, right? If there's supernatural evil, then there also has to be supernatural good. It's it's a scale, and so that's reassuring on one level. Also, like the practice of the folk healing and the folk magic on kind of like the white magic end, not the black magic end. That gave a lot of these farmers some sense, and these poor people some sense of control of their world. When they had very little control. Even the farmers were subject to the changes in the weather and everything else. It gave them some feeling of control when they had none. And believe it or not, this stuff actually, they found that if you believe it, it works more often than it technically should. But anyway, I want to transition back to the story of Moll Derry now. So Moll Derry, there were these legends about her, and there were many other transactions over the years. And that's the frustrating thing when you research something this old is you find all these accounts that just reference things that are kind of like community knowledge. Like, oh yeah, Moll Derry, and some people call her the fortune teller of the revolution still, or the the witch of the little world, and they just basically reference her as being there, and they talk about all the people who used to go see her and have their fortune told, or all the people who used to go to her for this or that or whatever. But there's not specific accounts necessarily. There's a few where someone finds money, or someone finds a lost animal or loved one. But as I went through and looked at all this stuff, one thing I want to do is first of all find the historical Moll Derry, like what could we actually find about her, which is isn't a lot. But luckily, she was so well known for this. Back in the 1800s, there were a couple of newspaper articles about her and her husband. Her husband was actually fairly well known as well. He was now he didn't live quite as long, but And her son carried on this tradition, Basil Derry, who also lived for a long time in Fayette County. But he was also a practitioner of folk magic. It appeared would charm his rifles to hunt. He was a famous hunter. But originally they were both, it appears from what the family has found in genealogy and from old newspaper articles, is that they actually came over at the tail end of the American Revolution as Hessian mercenaries. They were German. And they almost immediately switched sides. It may have been that they just got a free boat ride over and then bailed out to get land when it looked like the Americans were going to win. Initially, they settled in Bedford, but later they moved to Fayette County. And Valentine Derry, her husband, who's listed in the article as her husband, there was this article called The Mountain Hunter. Like I said, half the article is about Valentine Derry. It talked about him coming over as a Hessian and being in General Morgan's army. And then all of his skills at hunting, he would they described him walking in circles in the woods, and then just the animals would stop and he'd shoot them. Well, that's actually a magical ritual. They probably didn't realize they were describing it at the time. But then the second half of the article dealt with Moll Derry, his wife, who was known as the fortune teller of the Revolution, and it described how she would read coffee grounds and tea leaves in people's cups, among other things. But the interesting thing is they threw the line in at the end where she thought to many believe she made a pact with the devil or something to that effect. So even very early on, there's this idea that somehow she was a witch or connected to the devil. So, later accounts like her son, years later, also mentioned that he was the son of the fortune teller of the Revolution. We don't really know how she got that name, but clearly she was good at predicting things, and these are some of the stories that are lost. So you might think, how the fortune teller, how's the fortune teller evolved into the witch? Well, we talked about those stories earlier, and I spent a good portion of the second half of the book looking at all the accounts, every account I could find. So looking at each story one at a time, and I'll just give you a quick summary of this, but basically the story of the three hanged men, most of that is true. The catch is, and I should say this, most of these stories became popular, how I first learned them and how other writers learned about them and how they ended up on the internet, was through the writings of George Swetnam, who was a folklorist historian. He kind of did stuff like I did, except he worked at Pittsburgh Press. He wrote several books on Western PA, and in the early to mid 20th century, he compiled a lot of this information. And it appears he's the one that also compiled and thought that Moll Derry, Moll Dell, and Moll Wampa were all the same person. And one of the things he would actually do is accidentally cite some fictional accounts as historical accounts. So, an interesting article that he cited way back was, and he misinterpreted that, and it's actually interesting because the newsprint of the article, which is probably what you saw, is very blurred, but he thought of one word that, when Ned Cassidy came to Moll Derry to ask for something to help him sleep, and the response that he wrote in his book was, "Why are you coming to me for a potion after your dirty work at the mill pond?" And okay, potion makes sense. It actually doesn't say "I" in front, like people always insert the letter A. It just says, "Why are you coming to me for potion?" But instead, the original article says, "Why are you coming to me for poison?" And essentially, that changes the whole nature of what Moll Derry did and why he was coming to him. And there's actually other accounts that don't mention Moll Derry, but that say that they think Ned Cassidy poisoned John Updike so he wouldn't talk. And so it throws an interesting twist. Now, it's likely that he got poison off of Moll Derry, but that leaves Moll Derry in kind of a bad light as well, where if she had poison or herbs, or maybe she just knew of poisonous herbs that are actually all over the place. And so it kind of leaves this kind of question in the air as to what Moll Derry actually was also known for, and someone would approach her for poison. But some of the other stories, the hangman actually did hang, and it's not always verifiable. And the timelines are often the stories. Sometimes you can make them work, sometimes you can't. But the other interesting one is the story of Polly Williams. And the thing is, a lot of these writers back then, a lot of these writers in the 1800s, even the ones that wrote fictional accounts, like A.F. Hill, he was using real events but fictionalizing them. So a lot of the stuff in his story is based off of real people. Sometimes he combines some things, though, he adds some things. So we're not really sure if his detailed account of the encounter with Moll Derry is just entirely fictional when Polly Williams met her, or if it's based off of community lore like most of his accounts. And so we really can't say for sure, but she's always been connected with the story. And so what we think happened was, there was probably some truth behind it. It became fictionalized, and a lot of people accept the fictional story as the historical account. So really what happens is we're left with those first two stories, or first three stories, with kind of this sense, not being sure entirely. They can't be proven to be true, but they can't be proven to be false either. So it leaves us kind of back to the ambiguous legend. Where it gets really interesting, I think, is when you get to the story of the lost children, where Moll Derry clearly would have been dead. But there was another witch in the earlier accounts mentioned. The first account where they ever mentioned a witch searching for the children is a complete historical account. It's entirely accurate on all matters otherwise, so I'm assuming it's accurate on this, where some of the searchers got a witch from Somerset County to come over. And the only witch known in Somerset County at that time that has been written about, and I'm sure there were others, but that's been written about, is Moll Derry, and she was known to use an Erzspiegel. But the witch they say that they got from Somerset County, they had no mention of what she uses as divination, and she's unsuccessful and ends up getting lost in the woods and is sent home. The name Moll Wampler comes up in a fictional account that came up that combined the lost children with another lost child story that George Swetnam actually thought was a real historical account called the Erzspiegel. And the witch in that account is named Moll Wampler, and she uses the Erzspiegel to search for the children, and actually fails, and her horse bolts, gets spooked, and goes off into the woods after she encounters the children's father. And the searchers give up trying to find her, and a year later the father's wandering around. He still hasn't found the children. He sees this glint in the woods, and he goes over, and it's Moll Wampler's body. And the Erzspiegel had spilled out, and there's the glint of the light of the mirror, the earth mirror. But about 3 or 4 feet away were the bodies of his children. So the mirror did find the children, just not in the way people expected. But what happened is, like, those stories got combined, it seems, and Moll Derry was actually a real person, and she actually was involved in, her story is kind of interesting. She actually did use Erzspiegels, supposedly, and she would often be hired to help find treasure. And so magical treasure hunting was another function that folk practitioners would perform. That has a whole history under itself. But she often was known, and there was a famous metalsmith named Axie Yoder in Somerset County who was really obsessed with finding Braddock's gold, which was a lost treasure from the French and Indian War. And if you want to read about that, my very first book had a big section on it in Legends of the Lore of Western PA. But she supposedly led this Axie Yoder and his friends on this hunt for Braddock's gold. He kept moving the location and telling him that the earth gnomes, basically the earth spirits, the Erdgeist, kept moving the treasure when he almost found it. He kept paying her all this money to find the treasure, and she basically led him on a wild goose chase, digging holes over Somerset County to find this treasure that wasn't there. But so Moll Derry had a really shady reputation. Moll Derry and Moll had a really shady reputation, and they were both Moll Derry and Moll, the fictional or possibly real Moll Wampler. We're not sure if she's based on a real person. There were definitely 4 or 5 Wamplers in Bedford County at that time. And so both of them are described as very hag-like. that description got kind of carried over to Moll Derry over the years. So what happened is all those stories and all those pieces, using the Erzspiegel and looking for the treasures and all that stuff, got combined into the story of Moll Derry and told over and over again in the mid-20th century. So because people weren't really aware of the extent of the belief in witchcraft and folk magic, so it made sense that there was one witch, not three. But if you realistically think of it, the amount of geographical area, Fayette, Somerset, and Bedford County, you can't imagine an old woman walking across that distance in the early 1800s by herself. So the story then, it kind of loops back to Moll Derry. So, essentially what happens is Moll Derry transforms from this. And if you think about these stories too, the original stories, the three hanged men, the people that killed the peddler. I mean, Moll Derry really isn't acting much like a witch. She curses three bad men who basically are murderers. She warns a young woman about her impending murder, and then she tries to help find lost children. So this isn't really the stuff you associate with witchcraft. But she does fit more in that kind of witchmaster, hex doctor, middle ground. That really was ill-defined. And that's probably how she was thought of in the community. She was this kind of person that could go either way. And we're so used to putting things in specific categories, like it's either good or it's bad. And there was this, she was in that gray area, right? And trouble is, over time, as their legend developed, any type of folk magic and the belief in witchcraft in Pennsylvania continued for a long time. But in the progressive era, like the early 20th century, it became more criticized. Then out in York, PA, there was a murder over witchcraft, and it was looked down upon. And so any dabbling in any kind of folk magic was viewed as evil, and so those people kind of automatically became labeled as witches. And so she kind of transitions from this middle ground into a witch in the stories. There's, and so the fortune teller of the revolution becomes the witch of Monongahela. There's an interesting kind of epilogue to the story of Moll Derry, where around the turn of the century, in 1904 actually, this doctor went into a hospital in in Illinois, and basically a mental hospital. He was a doctor trying to do reform, and he found what was called a Utica crib, which were these like metal cages essentially that stick people in. Very inhumane. And they found this old woman like curled up. She couldn't even stand up straight. She had been in this thing for so long, trapped in one of these metal cages, and she had been there since around 1860. So imagine 44 years in a little cage, because she had been labeled as kind of unstable or insane at the time. And this doctor pulled her out to make her a case study of why we need to be more humane to the mentally ill. And it led to all these reforms. But that woman's name was Rhoda Derry. That was Moll Derry's granddaughter. And her granddaughter actually had been fine, and she had basically, they may not have ever met, but Moll Derry's son Jacob had moved out to Indiana, where she was born. Then they moved to Illinois. And sometime when she was around 17 or 18, she started to, she had been dating this young man, but his mother didn't like her, and people told her she put a curse on her, that the mother put a curse on Rhoda. And that over time, she started to become obsessed with witches, and she had, I'm sure, heard all the family stories about Moll Derry. And her behavior became more and more erratic, and she started seeing witches everywhere. And she even started firing. She got a gun and started shooting at them inside the house, and nobody else could see them, of course. So it got to the point where the family couldn't physically handle her anymore, and they sent her to an almshouse, which eventually led to her being sent to other institutions and put in the Utica crib. But today she'll probably be diagnosed with something like schizophrenia. But at the time, nobody knew. But they blamed some people at the time when she was committed blamed the legacy of witchcraft in the family. Interestingly, that came up again in 1904 when she was made kind of the poster person for reform. She only lived a few more years after 1904, but it was kind of overshadowed by the horrific conditions in the mental institutions. but she was never able to kind of escape the shadow that hung over the family at that point of Moll Derry. But anyway, I've been talking very fast and very long, and still didn't tell you half the stuff that would be in the book. So actually, I want to stop and see if anybody had any questions or wants something explained more, and wants more examples of anything or anything like that. Feel free to unmute and ask away. I've been researching kind of supernatural legends in Pennsylvania for, I guess, about 20 years now, and doing this. But the witchcraft itself, I'm not sure specifically the witchcraft what set me off. I think initially, like years ago, I was surprised at how many cases I kept finding of supposed witchcraft in Pennsylvania. Like most people, I was like, well, there were no witches here, Then you dig into this folk magic tradition, I always knew there were like these old wives' tales and things, but you don't realize how interconnected of a system it was since we were removed from it. And then, there were literally hundreds of these cases as I started doing work on it. I wrote my first book on witchcraft, but being from this area, the Witch of the Monongahela always seemed something that was very interesting to me because it was more local, But yeah, ever since I was a kid, I was interested in all weird history, so it's pretty much what I've been doing since. Yeah, there's cases all the way up to the present of people practicing witchcraft. In fact, I still know, like, of the Pennsylvania German type of practitioners that they call powwow. I actually know 3 or 4 active practitioners of that old style of the folk healing, not the witchcraft. But I do know of a recent case, actually 2 recent cases in West Virginia, where there were these practitioners of witchcraft that literally performed the rituals to turn into a witch in West Virginia. Because a lot of the there's Germans in Appalachia down there, and they actually went through the whole they did the worst ritual, and then they had all kinds of horrible things happen to them after, and a bunch of the family members died. It's actually a pretty horrific story, but there are people that still practice it, to this day. But also the witch now exists in urban legend too. So there's this parallel tradition of witches and urban legends, like up in Tyndall Cemetery, the witch Mary Black, where supposedly you go to her grave and say her name 3 times, and she jumps out of the grave and claws your face off, or at night she appears on top of you and claws your face, or something like that. But that's kind of it combines like parts of the Bloody Mary legend in it as well. But yeah, there's definitely like this whole folklore, like urban legend tradition of witchcraft as well, as popped up parallel to the actual folk magic practitioners. Then you have the whole kind of New Age neo-pagan, the Wiccan arm as well. So that's something different, but it's kind of running parallel to the old kind of traditional witchcraft. There are elements to it in some of the Pennsylvania Dutch traditions. Now, I don't know if Moll Derry was following that, but there are some elements of that among certain Pennsylvania Dutch practitioners. And it's kind of more, ties back to the old agricultural calendars and things, the way things would work. But it also was the religious. Part of it is like, that night was considered, back in Germany, that was the night the witches gathered on Brocken Mountain. So I think there were parallel traditions back even further with that. And there's some overlap between it, like as far as some of the calendars and practices and things. It's more the context. There's a lot of overlap in the ritual and the types of things that are done, but the context and interpretation is different. Like I said, the book, if you're interested, it does have give examples of other accounts in Western PA. There's some from Mercer County, Venango County, the alleged witch trial in Allegheny County. And it certainly goes into more detail of everything I talked about tonight, more examples of how the folk magic worked among the Pennsylvania Dutch and Pennsylvania Germans in general. But the way it worked was also very similar for the English, even though the English didn't like to admit it was there. and even like modern and what even old practices of hoodoo among African Americans all works in very similar fashion. So yeah, that's how, these sites in the book you can still go to today. By the way, like the White Rocks, you can go up to those today. And I actually have several, like here's an old postcard that was in the book that actually the writing at the bottom talks about Polly Williams and the White Rocks. There is a Derry Hill down in Fayette County that actually is either the hill she lived on or Basil lived on. I think it's the one she lived on, but I'm not 100% positive. And the family kept absorbing each other's property at various points. But they were actually very poor, and they subsisted on hunting. I should have added, Moll Derry actually also made whiskey. She had a still and would sell whiskey as well. So that was her other way to make income. So you got whiskey and your fortune told at once.
Seems like no one has any other questions, right? So I think we can conclude our author talk. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and thank you, Tom, for giving such a great talk. So
Thanks, everybody.
We'll see you, everyone.